Welcome to The Political Independent, your home for a calm, nonpartisan look at the news and thought-provoking discussions on how to improve the American political process. I'm your host, Gregory Anderson. Welcome, my friend, my fellow independent, to the first episode of this podcast. I am extremely excited to be here, even though it's a week later than I had originally planned, but that's okay. We have a great show for you. Today's podcast will be shorter than normal. If you listen to the trailer, I did say that each episode will be roughly 30 to 45 minutes long. Today's podcast will be much shorter than that. I wanted to ease into the content and will be in full swing starting next week on Tuesday. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about the current landscape of the 2020 election, sort of my thoughts, and why I believe that if Joe Biden were to lose this election here in 2020, it would be absolutely the worst loss ever, considering all of the factors going against Donald Trump. And it's so overwhelming. And I still find it just crazy that he even has a chance. And also kind of want to give some of my thoughts on who I plan on voting for. Like, as an independent, I know, like, I've been kind of going back and forth. I'm sure that's the case with some of you. So I want to dig into that here, and we'll go ahead and get you out of here on a short opening episode. And as a reminder, and especially if you didn't listen to the trailer, I did want to let you know that whenever I cover stories, like, for instance, if we happen to cover the mailing situation with the USPS next week, I use sources from all sides of the political spectrum. I think it's important for you and I, as independents, as we begin to navigate the news here on a weekly basis, is to have a balanced news diet. And of course, if you're an independent, you likely listen to or follow news from both sides of the political spectrum. But to me, it's not just enough to go to CNN or Fox News and call it a day. Using sources like the Raw Story and the Daily Wire. Now, the Raw Story and the Daily Wire are both really on the opposite ends of the political spectrum. The Raw Story is very, very left, and the Daily Wire is pretty far to the right. And I mean that they're very highly partisan sites. They're openly partisan, so that's important to still go to some of those places. And I don't mean just stopping there. You want to broaden it out to places like the National Review or Vox, the Christian Science Monitor, Reuters, NPR, and a lot more. I can seriously rattle off a lot more, but I don't want to bore you. But honestly, I think it's necessary if we want to find more pragmatic solutions to issues that we care about and try to help bring this country together. That's really what I want to do with every segment of this podcast, whether it's me going over a news story and let you know how the left and the right covered it, whether it's me having people on, like I am going to have a few of the ladies over at Compassion America on the podcast very soon. And there's some really interesting things that they have going on there, and I can't wait to have them on. But whether it's those or interviews with other independents, asking questions, everything that we do here is all with the goal in mind to looking at multiple sides of a story to find more pragmatic solutions to try to help bring this country together. That's my main goal. That's the MO of this podcast. Okay, let's look at the current landscape of the election here in 2020.
In defeating COVID, we have over 5 million cases.
Especially now. Over the past few months, we've learned what's essential, rising to the challenge, not denying it. We've learned who is essential too.
But let us be clear. If Donald Trump is reelected, all the progress we have made.
Because whenever we look to this White House for some leadership or consolation or any semblance of steadiness.
I'll title this podcast
What
The
we get
Current
instead is
Landscape of the 2020 Election, primarily because how the election landscape has shifted so often this year, and calamity could really be around the corner. So who knows what will be deciding the election come time November. But as it stands today, Joe Biden is in pretty good shot to win the election. As I'm sure you've been paying attention to the polls. If you go to Real Clear Politics, this is where I get most of my polls from, and you will be familiar with it by the end of this election, because I'm really a fan of how they have their site set up. Biden's ahead in the Real Clear Politics national average he's up by almost 8 points. And you look at the top battleground states, and if you look at the breakdown of those battleground states, he's up in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Florida, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Ohio, Michigan, and Nevada. He's been doing pretty good, and that's how the polls have been looking over the last month or so. And considering all that has happened over the last few months with the start of the coronavirus, really, I would say things start getting serious in March and then April, but then you have the protesting and the rioting due to the killing of George Floyd. You take all that into account, what's happened with the economy, plus millions of Americans out of work, and the Joe Biden's lead makes sense. But as you know, the polls are beginning to tighten. Surprisingly, the polls are beginning to tighten, and I'm sure most of you saw that outlier poll, which is what people are calling it, but it showed Trump behind just by 4 points nationally, which is within the margin of error. This election shouldn't be close, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, but this election should not be close. But I would caution people to not make predictions just yet about the election. Don't get too excited about cabinet picks for Biden just yet. Things could change in a hurry, and that's really been the story of this year. And I don't think I have to recount all of that, but the political landscape, the landscape of the 2020 election is not the same right now as it was in January. It's also totally different now than it was in February. Does anyone remember the impeachment? Like that was supposedly a big deal, and now that will have virtually no effect on the election. And I'll be honest, I was quite bullish on Trump's prospects of winning the election. I, for the most part, had him winning by what Biden is up by right now, if not more so in some of these other states. But of course, once the coronavirus truly hit and began taking effect on the economy in April, where millions of Americans were out of a job and filing for unemployment, things can change in a hurry. And as an independent, my priorities are much different from a Democrat or Republican. I've been sort of going back and forth on trying to decide who I want to vote for. I've been old enough, I'm 28, but I've been old enough to vote in the last two general elections. That's 2016 and 2012. I voted in 2016 and I voted third party. Have yet to vote for one of the major two parties, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do this year. And I'm really curious, and I would love to answer questions on the podcast weekly, but I want to know, who are you planning to vote for, or if you're undecided? Because right now I'm currently undecided. I was teetering. There was a chance that I would have voted for a Democrat. I did donate to Tulsi Gabbard. I'll be open about. I donated to Tulsi Gabbard's campaign. I didn't think she had much of a realistic chance to get the nomination, but I vote for who I believe is best, and that's normally what I'll always suggest that everyone do. Vote for who you believe is best. It's never a wasted vote to vote for who you believe in, and don't allow partisans on the left and the right to tell you otherwise. You have that option to vote for who you believe in. And with that being said, I have been going back and forth really for the last 3 years. Because I'm not happy with how Trump is incredibly divisive. But I'm also not happy with how the Democrats have handled his presidency. I didn't like how they handled the impeachment. Just really the sheer amount of stories that rose to national stories that had no business being there was absolutely ridiculous. And that kind of bothered me. And for a while, well, really still at this point as well, my mindset is not to reward bad behavior. And that's really what I've seen from the Democrats really since 2016. But Trump hasn't made it easy at all to vote for him either. So third party is likely the choice for me. I will say, had they chosen Amy Klobuchar at the top of the ticket, I may have voted for them, but that was still unlikely. I'm curious to think, have you made up your mind yet? So email me at politicpodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear who you plan on voting for. Okay, so to end the podcast, as I sort of teased there in the beginning, I believe that if Joe Biden were to lose this election, it would be the worst loss ever. And I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic, because that's just not the type of person that I am at all. I believe there's enough data to support that particular argument. And really, the gist of my argument is the sheer amount of things going against Trump. You know, we talked about impeachment, but you can toss that to the side because that's not really going to have too much of an effect on the election. The millions of people out of work due to the coronavirus and Trump's handling of it, plus how he managed to piss off both the left and the right with his handling of the protests and the riots, should sink him. And this should be a blowout, almost like a 50-state sweep. And I say that because you look at, like I said, the things going against him. And let's talk about something that's not going to have an effect on the election, at least this year, at least I don't believe, is the incumbent advantage. Now, we talked about this. I did an episode on the previous podcast that I did titled The American Electorate. And this episode was called Stuck in a Loop. And we really talked about why incumbents tend to win re-election. And there's some interesting facts that I'd like to tie into this particular argument. On Yahoo Finance, there's a fantastic article that they read that was titled Economic Indicator Suggests Trump Winning Re-election. Now, of course, this was in February 7th, so a long time ago, and really centuries ago, seeing how things have gone this year. But listen to this.
With the guest yesterday, it's the economy, stupid. Is that what's sort of driving this perception that Trump's going to win again?
Yeah, so we've looked into this and done quite a bit of research on it. If you look back at the past century and you look at all the incumbent races where there was an incumbent president seeking re-election, if there was a recession within the 2 years leading up to the election, that incumbent has not been re-elected and there's been a new president. If there was no recession, then the incumbent actually won re-election.
Every single time?
Yeah, it has virtually a flawless track record back to 1932.
And given that we have low interest rates, you also talk about
and one thing that I discussed in that episode, and it was a very interesting thought, was, does that rule apply to elections pre-1932? And it does. It does. In 18, it does. It simply does. In 1890, between 1890 and 1900, we had 4 recessions. 4. So within those years, so within that decade, So essentially, within a decade, the United States was in a recession. So essentially, for half of the decade, the United States was in a recession. And that rule of the incumbent losing during a recession did play out during those years. You can see James Garfield, a Republican, was elected in 1880. In 1884, Grover Cleveland was elected, a Democrat. In 1888, now if you go back all the way to 1882, from 1882 to 1900, there were 6 recessions, 6, totaling to almost up to a decade. And if you look at the election results, it sort of that rule sort of bears out. So if you go to 1880, James Garfield was elected. He's a Republican, or was a Republican. Of course, he's long dead. Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, was elected in 1884. Benjamin Harrison, a Republican, elected in 1888. Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, elected in 1892. William McKinley, a Republican, was elected in 1896. And that sort of ended that sort of bunny hop rhythm. But not only that, the popular vote is another thing that sort of cuts against Trump, or should cut against Trump. Now, if he were to win re-election this year, I don't think he would be winning the popular vote. But for the sake of this argument, let's say he doesn't. He'd be the first president to win re-election losing the popular vote. And honestly, prior to George W. Bush, each president who had lost the popular vote their first time in office lost re-election. George Bush won the popular vote in 2024. That was by 3+ million votes. So you take that, the popular vote, and the fact that Trump's not likely to win that. You take the fact that whenever there's a recession, the incumbent normally loses. You take that and you pair it with the fact that Trump is someone who is a highly divisive figure. You also pair that with his handling of the coronavirus and the riots and the protests from the murder of George Floyd, and you would think that Biden should be winning this election with a 50-state sweep. Maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but he should win this election by a lot. And that, to me, is indicative of how weak of a candidate Joe Biden is. And I'm not just shitting on Joe Biden. I don't have an axe to grind against the man. But when you take into account all of the things going against Trump and all of the, in theory, again, this is just theory, of course, is my opinion, and I would love to hear what you all think about it. But in theory, Trump should have no chance of winning the election. Now, of course, if they had, I don't know, someone like Michelle Obama on the ticket, or if Barack Obama himself was running this year, this thing would not be even remotely close. Or if they would have had someone exciting this year, this thing would not be remotely close. But I think this is, again, indicative of simply how weak of a candidate Joe Biden is. And you can see that from some of the other polls. I think one was the most interesting thing is that most people aren't voting for Joe Biden because they like Joe Biden. They're voting for Joe Biden simply because he is not Trump, which is honestly how Trump won a lot of votes last time around, when people voted for him simply because he wasn't Hillary Clinton. But that is really all I have. And I would love to hear, again, what you all think. Thank you so much for joining me for this first episode of The Political Independence. We have another podcast coming out on Thursday, and that one's really an introduction just for me personally. I want to give you an in-depth look at my story and how I became an independent. I haven't talked about that. I can talk about that in the trailer, and I really want to give you that in-depth look into who I am before we really dig into this podcast. But as I said, thank you so much for joining me for this first episode. Please rate and subscribe to the show, and I will see you on Thursday.